This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at how World War II totally reshaped the Americas, particularly, of course, the U.S. and Canada. And it's pretty wild to think about how these countries went from, being totally isolationists to being like major players in this huge global conflict. So we're going to kind of trace that dramatic shift.
Yeah.
From the memory of World War I to the pivotal moment of Pearl Harbor, and get ready for some surprises along the way, because things weren't always quite as black and white as they might seem in the history books.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a period that really reveals so much about how nations react under pressure and how quickly global dynamics can shift and change.
Okay, so before the war even started, both the U.S. and Canada were pretty much set on staying out of global conflicts. I mean, they'd seen the horrors of World War I, and they were still dealing with the fallout from the Great Depression. So can you set the scene for us a little bit? What was driving this intense isolationism?
Well, for both countries, another European war was the last thing they wanted to get involved with, the U.S. in particular, passed the Neutrality Acts in the mid-1930s, which were basically designed to keep them from getting entangled in foreign wars. These acts prohibited things like arms sales and loans to countries that were at war. I don't know, does that remind you of anything going on right now? It really makes you wonder, when is it right for a country to just stay out of a conflict, and when does that maybe become more of a problem?
Yeah, it is a fascinating parallel. Definitely makes you think about the responsibility of, powerful countries to intervene or not in global crises. But in the 1930s, it seems like the real feeling was America first. And what about Canada? They were in a slightly different position, right?
Right. Canada had these strong ties to Great Britain through the Commonwealth. So, their involvement felt almost inevitable right from the start. But even their prime minister at the time, Mackenzie King, he hesitated to commit. He was very aware that the public was wary of getting involved in another war.
So both countries are struggling economically. They've got the memory of World War I kind of hanging over them. And public opinion is really strongly against intervention. But, at the same time, across the world, things are really heating up. The Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, they're on the move. And they're not exactly playing by the rules.
Exactly. And, as news of their aggression and the atrocities that they were committing started filtering back to North America, public opinion did begin to shift. Especially in the U.S., leaders like President Roosevelt saw the growing threat. And they started to really make the case for taking on a more active role in global affairs.
It's interesting how leaders have to balance public opinion with strategic necessity. I mean, they can't get too far ahead of the people, or they risk losing support.
Yeah.
So how did Roosevelt kind of navigate that tricky situation?
Well, he took a very calculated approach. The Lend-Lease Act of 1941 was a real turning point. This program allowed the U.S. to send essential aid to the Allies, especially to Britain and to the Soviet Union, but without officially joining the war. So it was a very clever way to thread that needle, so to speak. It let Roosevelt support the Allies while still appeasing, those isolationist voices back home.
I'm just looking at some figures here. And the amount of aid that they provided through Lend-Lease was really staggering. We're talking billions of dollars worth of weapons, food, and other supplies. I mean, it really shows how committed the U.S. was becoming to the Allied cause, even before they officially entered the war. But it was a huge risk, wasn't it? I mean, what if the Axis powers had won?
Oh, absolutely. Lend-Lease was definitely a gamble. But for Roosevelt, it was a calculated one. He really believed that supporting the Allies was ultimately in America's best interest, even if it meant, kind of bending the rules of neutrality a little bit. And, remember, this is all happening against the backdrop of the Great Depression. It's not like the U.S. had unlimited resources to just throw around.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that context, right? I mean, they're pouring billions into this program while still trying to recover from this devastating economic crisis. So things are getting tense. The U.S. is tiptoeing closer and closer to involvement. And then, bam, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. That's where everything changes.
Absolutely. The attack on Pearl Harbor was just monumental. It completely shattered American isolationism overnight, and it catapulted the nation into a war that it had tried so desperately to avoid. It was a brutal wake-up call.
I can't even imagine what it must have been like to hear that news on the radio that morning. A surprise attack, thousands dead or wounded, the Pacific Fleet in ruins. The world must have felt like it was ending.
Well, for those who lived through it, it absolutely did. It's impossible to overstate the psychological impact of Pearl Harbor on the American people. The shock, the anger, the fear. It galvanized the nation in a way that, I don't think anything else could have.
And just like that, the U.S. is at war.
Yeah. It's incredible, isn't it, how a single event can so drastically alter the course of history. And it is interesting to note that Canada actually entered the war earlier, in September 1939, shortly after Germany invaded Poland. But for the U.S., Pearl Harbor was the real catalyst, the thing that truly launched them onto the world stage. And once the U.S. was in, they really went all in. Their mobilization was incredibly fast. I mean, we're talking about a country that shifted its entire economy into war production mode practically overnight.
Yeah, when you look at the numbers, it's pretty mind-blowing. Factories retooled, shipyards working around the clock.
Yeah.
Millions of men and women joining the military. What was it like for everyday people during this time? I mean, it must have felt like their whole world had changed.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was a total transformation of American society. People were making real sacrifices, rationing food, gas, all sorts of essential things, planting victory gardens, buying war bonds, sending their sons and daughters off to fight.
Yeah.
There was this real shared sense of purpose. Like, everyone had a role to play in the war effort.
And they were fighting on multiple fronts, too. In Europe, against Nazi Germany, and in the Pacific against Japan. Can you talk a bit about, the key battles that really shaped the course of the war?
Well, in Europe, the D-Day landings in Normandy in 1944 were really pivotal. This was a massive operation involving American, Canadian, and British forces, and it really marked the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe from Nazi control. The fighting was incredibly intense, the casualties were heavy, but it was a major turning point in the war.
Yeah, I've seen some of the photos and footage from D-Day.
Yeah.
And it's hard to comprehend the scale of it all. Thousands of ships, millions of men, and this incredible coordination across different countries. It's hard to imagine how they pulled it off.
It really was a remarkable feat of logistics and military strategy. And, it highlights the importance of alliances in wartime. I mean, the Allied victory in World War II wouldn't have been possible without that close cooperation between the U.S., Canada, Britain, and other nations.
And then in the Pacific, you have these iconic battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where American forces faced just fierce resistance from the Japanese. What made the fighting in the Pacific so different from, the European theater?
I think the Pacific War was really characterized by these brutal island hopping campaigns. The Japanese were dug in on these heavily fortified islands, and they were determined to fight to the death. The battles were often fought hand to hand, and the casualties were just horrific on both sides. It was a completely different type of warfare.
Yeah, one of the most striking images, I think, from World War II is that photo of the Marines raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi during the Battle of Iwo Jima. It's become such a symbol of American resilience and determination. But, it came at a huge cost.
Yeah, thousands of Marines lost their lives in the battle for Iwo Jima alone. It's a sobering reminder that behind every, iconic image or victory, there are countless individual stories of sacrifice and suffering.
And back on the home front, things were changing in a big way, too.
Yeah.
With so many men away fighting, women stepped into roles that they'd never held before. It was a real turning point for women in the workforce.
Oh, absolutely. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter really, really represents this shift. Women took on jobs in factories, shipyards, all these industries that had been traditionally dominated by men. They were welding, riveting, building tanks and planes, doing their part to keep the war effort going.
It must have been incredibly challenging for them, not just, the physical labor, but also the societal pressures. Did they face any pushback?
Oh, definitely. There was still a lot of prejudice against women working outside the home. They often faced lower wages than men doing the same jobs. And there was this expectation that, they'd go right back to their traditional roles after the war ended. But, despite those challenges, women really proved that they were capable and essential contributors to the war effort.
And it wasn't just women. The war also highlighted the ongoing struggles for equality faced by African Americans and other minority groups.
Yeah, it's important to remember that while the Allied nations were fighting for, freedom and democracy abroad, they were still grappling with racial injustice at home. For African Americans, the war was a double battle, fighting for victory overseas and fighting for equality in their own country.
Yeah, the WWII campaign really captures that duality, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home.
Exactly. And even within the armed forces, segregation was still the norm. African American soldiers often served in segregated units, and they were denied opportunities that were available to their white counterparts.
Yeah, despite those obstacles, many African Americans served with incredible distinction. The Tuskegee Airmen, for example, were a group of highly skilled African American pilots who proved their bravery and expertise in combat, flying escort missions, protecting American bombers over Europe.
They faced so much discrimination, and yet they overcame those barriers to become one of the most decorated units in the U.S. Army Air Forces. Their story is a powerful testament to their courage, skill, and determination in the face of adversity.
And it wasn't just African Americans. Indigenous people in both the U.S. and Canada also faced discrimination. And yet they, too, answered the call to serve, hoping to earn recognition and equality through their contributions.
Yeah, it's a tragic irony, isn't it, that these groups were fighting for freedom and democracy abroad while still facing prejudice and injustice in their own countries. It's a reminder that the fight for equality is an ongoing struggle, and it doesn't end just because there's a war going on.
And speaking of injustices, we have to talk about the forced relocation and imprisonment of Japanese Americans and Japanese Canadians during the war. What led to this dark chapter in both countries' histories?
Well, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, fear and prejudice really took hold. There was this widespread paranoia about Japanese spies and saboteurs, even though there was no real evidence to support those fears. And this hysteria led to the internment of over 100,000 Japanese Americans and thousands of Japanese Canadians. They were forced to leave their homes and businesses and were imprisoned in camps, often in harsh conditions, for years.
It's hard to believe that something like this could happen in countries that pride themselves on freedom and democracy.
It is. It's a shameful episode in both countries' histories. And it's a stark reminder of how easily wartime hysteria and racial prejudice can erode civil liberties. And, it wasn't until decades later that both the U.S. and Canada issued official apologies and offered reparations for this terrible injustice.
It's a reminder that even in times of crisis, we have to be vigilant about protecting the rights of all citizens, regardless of their race or ethnicity. So we've talked about the sacrifices, the battles, the social changes, but there was also this huge ethical dilemma that emerged during the war, the decision to use the atomic bomb.
Right. This is one of the most ethically challenging and controversial decisions of the entire war. The U.S. dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, effectively ending the war, but at a horrific cost. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed or injured in those bombings.
And to this day, people still debate whether using the bomb was justified or not.
Exactly. There's no easy answer. Historians still argue about whether it was truly necessary to force Japan's surrender, or whether it was, primarily a show of force meant to intimidate the Soviet Union, which was emerging as a rival power.
It's a decision that raises so many questions.
Yeah.
Of the nature of war, the limits of acceptable violence, and the long-term consequences of such a devastating weapon. This is where it gets really tough. Historians still debate whether the bomb was truly necessary. I mean, what do you think? Was it justified, or was there another way?
Well, I think it's something that everyone has to grapple with individually. It's a decision that continues to haunt us, reminding us of the awesome destructive power we possess and the profound responsibility that comes with it.
Yeah. It's hard to wrap your head around the sheer scale of the destruction, and the loss of life, both military and civilian. But even amidst all that darkness, there were some glimmers of hope. The war effort had actually pulled both the U.S. and Canada out of the Great Depression, and their economies were really booming at this point.
Yeah, the war had this really transformative effect on both countries, economically and in terms of their global standing. The U.S. in particular emerged as a global superpower. Their industries were intact and their military might was really unmatched.
So even though the war was devastating, it also kind of paved the way for this period of economic prosperity, at least for North America.
Yeah.
But what about the rest of the world? I mean, Europe and Asia were in ruins.
That's right. The war had left much of the world in shambles. Millions were dead, cities were destroyed, economies were shattered. And this is where we see the U.S. taking on this new role, a leadership role in shaping the post-war world.
So how did that play out? What specific actions did the U.S. take to help rebuild and reshape the global order?
Well, I think first and foremost, there was the Marshall Plan. This was a massive U.S.-led initiative to provide economic aid to war-torn Europe. This was absolutely crucial in helping European countries rebuild their infrastructure, restart their industries, and kind of get back on their feet.
It was a huge investment, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Billions of dollars poured into rebuilding Europe. Was it purely out of altruism, or were there also strategic considerations at play?
Well, it was definitely a mix of both. On the one hand, there was a genuine desire to help Europe recover, but there were also these, strategic concerns about the spread of communism. The Soviet Union was expanding its influence in Eastern Europe, and the U.S. wanted to prevent communism from, spreading further west by helping to create these, stable, democratic, and prosperous nations in Western Europe. The U.S. hoped to kind of contain Soviet influence and promote its own vision of a free world.
So the seeds of the Cold War were already being sown, even as World War II was ending.
Exactly. The wartime alliance between the U.S. and the Soviet Union began to unravel pretty quickly after the war ended, as their ideological differences and geopolitical ambitions became more apparent.
And it wasn't just about rebuilding Europe, right? There was also this whole new system of global institutions being created.
Yeah, this is when we see the birth of organizations like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. These institutions were designed to promote international cooperation, stabilize the global economy, and hopefully prevent future conflicts. They were a direct response to the horrors of World War II, a way to try and create a more peaceful and just world order.
It's fascinating how a period of such intense conflict could also give rise to such a surge of international cooperation.
I think it's often out of the ashes of destruction that we see the most profound moments of innovation and collaboration. World War II forced nations to really confront the fragility of peace and the interconnectedness of our world. And, it also led to some incredible technological advancements.
Oh, right. I'd almost forgotten about that.
Yeah.
Easy to overlook how much innovation came out of wartime necessity.
Absolutely. Things like radar, jet engines, antibiotics. I mean, these were all developed or refined during World War II.
Yeah.
And they went on to revolutionize various fields and improve countless lives. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, human ingenuity can shine through.
So to sum it all up, World War II was this incredibly transformative event for the Americas. It pulled them out of isolationism, thrust them out of the global stage, and really shaped their economies, their societies, and their place in the world for decades to come. It's a story of tragedy and triumph, of destruction and creation, and its echoes are still felt today.
Yeah, and I think as we reflect on this history, it raises some important questions for us today. What lessons can we learn from the complexities of this era? How can we apply those lessons to the challenges that we face now in a world that's still grappling with conflict, inequality, and the threat of nuclear war?
It's a powerful question to leave our listeners with, for sure. World War II might be a chapter in the history books, but its legacies are still very much alive. It reminds us of the fragility of peace, the importance of international cooperation, and the need to confront injustice wherever we find it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into a truly pivotal period in history. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.